First story, Ice Highway, Russia, 1982. I've never told anyone about this, not a single soul. It's been years now, and I still don't know if I was losing my mind or if it was something else. But what happened to me on that stretch of road, in Siberia, on that freezing night, still haunts me like it was yesterday. I was driving down that godforsaken stretch of highway, just me and the endless snow. It's the kind of drive that makes you question everything you've ever believed in. The kind of cold that gnaws at your bones, no matter how many layers you wear. I was used to it by now. Long, quiet hours on the road, the truck's engine, hum filling the cabin. But this night felt different from the moment I pulled onto that icy road. I remember looking out at the horizon, the pale orange glow of the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. That's when I first saw the lights. At first I thought it was just another aurora borealis, but the lights didn't stay still like they should have. They were shifting, moving in ways that didn't make sense. And then they started to move towards me fast. I could feel my stomach drop as I stared in disbelief. They weren't natural. They didn't belong there. The closer they got, the more intense they became. And then I saw it. Above the road, a huge glowing object was just hanging there, like it was watching me, waiting. I remember my heart hammering in my chest. My hands gripped the wheels so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to keep going, to just drive away from it. But something was wrong. The truck started shaking, as if something was messing with the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and all I saw was the light. Bright, almost blinding. My head started to feel heavy, like I was being sucked into something I couldn't escape from. I tried to hit the gas to get the truck moving faster, but it didn't respond the way it should have. It was like the engine was alive, like it was doing its own thing, independent of my commands. That's when I felt it. The air in the cabin shifted. It was sudden, like stepping into a hot sauna, then freezing cold all at once. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. My skin went clammy with sweat, and my head felt light, almost like I was floating, like gravity had lost its grip on me. I slammed the brakes, but nothing happened. The truck kept moving forward faster than I could ever make it go. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I looked out the window, and the lights were still there, now closer, moving in sync with me. It was like they were pulling me, pushing me along the road against my will. Panic set in, and I could hear the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the radio, but it was nothing but static. The shaking in the truck grew stronger, and I swear the ground beneath me felt like it was vibrating, like the whole world was shaking in sync with the truck. Then, just as suddenly as it all started, the shaking stopped. I couldn't explain. The truck, the lights, everything, it just stopped. The cabin went silent, too silent. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, ragged and shallow. I don't know how long I sat there in that silence. It could have been minutes, maybe hours, but I snapped out of it when I realized something wasn't right. I looked at the dashboard. The clock was wrong, completely wrong. I checked the tachograph, the thing that tracks the truck's movement, and it didn't make sense. It was like I had driven miles, kilometers, without remembering a single second of it. I didn't know how I had ended up there, in the middle of nowhere, with no signs of where I had been or how long it had taken to get there. My eyes darted around the empty road, but there was nothing. No tire marks, no broken snow, no trace of where I had been. Just the same frozen wilderness surrounding me, as if I had been placed there by something else. I stepped out of the truck, my legs shaking, unsure if I could stand. My boots sank into the snow, and I felt a wave of dizziness hit me again. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all, but there was nothing to make sense of. The road stretched out in front of me, the same as it always had, but everything felt wrong. The lights were gone, the object was gone, and I was just standing there in the middle of the Siberian cold, with no idea how I had gotten there. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally got back into the truck and started it up again, the weird feeling didn't go away. It's been years, but I still don't know what happened to me that night, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget it. As I sat there in the truck, I couldn't stop looking at the dashboard, at the clock, and the tachograph. I don't know what I was expecting to see, but what I saw didn't make sense. The time was off. It couldn't be right. It had skipped hours. The thing that scared me the most was the fact that the tachograph, the one thing that was supposed to tell me exactly how far I had driven, showed I'd gone hundreds of kilometers in what felt like mere minutes. My heart dropped into my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cold had messed with the equipment. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel for a moment. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. I had no memory of what had happened during that time. There was no fog, no blackout. It was as if I had just appeared at that spot without any transition. I looked around again, trying to make sense of the road I was on. The snow was undisturbed, as if no vehicle had passed through it in days. Hell, even the air felt too still, too thick. There was something about it that screamed wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just the shock messing with me, but I couldn't get rid of that feeling. It's hard to explain, but imagine being in a place you know, a place you've been 100 times, and suddenly it's unfamiliar. That's how I felt. The road was the same, but it was as if it wasn't anymore. I thought about trying to make sense of it, but every time I started to rationalize, my mind would come back to that one moment. The lights, the way they moved, the object above me, the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to believe it was an abduction, but that's exactly what it felt like. A part of me wanted to believe it was just some sort of freak natural phenomenon, a glitch in the world system, maybe even some kind of military test. But I couldn't shake the thought that there was something not human about it. As I pulled the truck back onto the road, my hands were still shaking, and I couldn't stop looking at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that bright light following me again. I drove for what felt like an eternity, but the same dead silence surrounded me. The cold outside the truck was unbearable, but inside I was sweating. I wanted to speed up, to get away from whatever it was that had happened, but I couldn't. Something held me there. That weight in my chest, the one that was making it hard to breathe. And then, just as I was thinking of pulling over to collect myself, I saw something. In the distance, barely visible through the foggy windshield, saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way I understood. The shape was off, almost distorted. I slowed down, my heart hammering in my chest, wondering if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I drew closer, the figure didn't move. And it wasn't human. I don't know why, but I stopped the truck. I was frozen in place, staring at this thing that wasn't supposed to be there. At first I thought it was a man just standing still, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized something was wrong. Its body was too thin, unnaturally so. The outline didn't look right. Its legs were too long, and its arms hung by its sides in a strange way, almost as if they were too long too. The figure had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me or not. Something in me told me not to go closer, to just keep driving, but I couldn't make myself leave. I don't even know why I kept staring, but I couldn't take my eyes off of it. For a moment, I felt like I was losing control of myself, like I wasn't fully in my body anymore. That's when the figure moved. Slowly, unnaturally, its head tilted in a way that made no sense. It wasn't the kind of motion a person could make. No human could bend their neck like that. I swear, it felt like time itself slowed down as it began to walk toward me. But it didn't walk in any way I'd ever seen before. Its legs moved in jerky, disjointed motions, as if each step was calculated and deliberate. The truck's engine roared to life suddenly, and I was back in control, slamming my foot on the gas, desperate to get away. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged, but as I looked back through the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. It had just vanished, like it was never there. But I knew it was. It had been. I didn't dare stop after that. I just kept driving, not looking back. The road was endless, stretching out in front of me like a ribbon of ice that led nowhere. Every time I looked into the rearview mirror, my mind screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. I had to make sure the thing wasn't following me. The truck seemed to drive on its own, like it was pushing forward without any input from me. The whole cabin felt wrong, warmer than it should have been. But there was still that lingering cold in the pit of my stomach. I felt like I was moving, through a dream, like none of this was real, and every time I glanced outside I expected to see something, anything, that would break the illusion. But nothing happened. The landscape was still just frozen emptiness. It was the same Siberian road, and yet everything felt so off. The more I tried to focus on the road, the more the weight in my chest grew heavier. I kept telling myself that it was just my nerves, just the stress, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I don't know how long I drove, but it was hours before I saw a sign, an actual sign of civilization. A small village, barely visible in the distance. I tried to push myself to get there, thinking I could stop and figure out what had happened. But the closer I got, the more the truck started to slow down. I checked the gas, and it was full, so it wasn't that. It just stopped. My heart raced as the engine sputtered and died in the middle of the road. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I sat there for what felt like hours. The truck was completely still, the only noise coming from the wind scraping against the windows. I tried starting it again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It was dead. I had no choice but to get out and try to figure something out. The cold hit me like a slap in the face as soon as I stepped out of the truck. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my breath coming out in thick clouds. The village was still far off, so I started walking, but every step felt like it took forever. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of life, no lights, no sound of dogs barking or people moving about. Nothing. It didn't make sense. I'd seen the sign. I knew there was supposed to be something there. As I got closer, I realized there was no one around. No cars parked outside houses, no lights in windows. It felt like a ghost town. I walked through the empty streets, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound breaking the eerie silence. There was one house in the distance with its door slightly open, a flickering light coming from the inside. Maybe someone was home. I felt a sense of relief, thinking I could finally find help. But as I approached the house, something didn't sit right. The door was wide open, yet everything was still. No voices, no movement. I stopped in front of the door and hesitated. Something told me I shouldn't go in, but I had no choice. I was freezing, and the village looked abandoned anyway. I pushed. The door opened slowly, and the cold air from inside hit me like a wall. It was warmer than outside, but it wasn't right. The house was empty, but it wasn't. I could feel it. The air felt thick, like something was in there with me. I stepped inside, cautiously looking around. The room was dark, only lit by a faint flickering light coming from the corner. I moved toward it, each step making the floor creak under my weight. As I got closer, I saw what it was. An old television, the screen fuzzy and static-filled. It was the only thing on in the room, and it was like the whole place was in a trance, stuck in time. I turned to leave, but before I could make it to the door, something caught my eye. A picture on the wall. It was of a family, or at least, it looked like a family. But the faces were blurry, like someone had rubbed them out. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized they looked wrong. There was something about the faces that didn't belong. The whole family, even the children, were distorted, like they had been altered. I felt nauseous, a wave of dread crashing over me. Something was terribly wrong with this place. I needed to get out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I backed away from the picture, my legs feeling weak. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing in on me as I tried to make sense of everything. I couldn't stop looking at the distorted faces in the photo. It was like they were staring right through me, watching my every move. My chest tightened with panic, but the door was behind me, my only way out. I turned quickly, almost stumbling over my own feet, and rushed back toward it, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. But as I reached for the door handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I whipped around, in shock, my breathing sharp and erratic. I was trapped. I grabbed the handle, trying to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door with my fists, yelling for help, though I knew no one could hear me. The house was silent again. It was as if I had disturbed something, broken some sort of unspoken rule. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving. A shadow, just a flicker, moving across the wall. My blood ran cold. My eyes darted toward it, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. The shadow moved again, and this time I saw it clearly. A figure, just a glimpse, moving behind a doorway, in the back of the house. I froze, not knowing whether to run or approach it. The figure didn't move like a person. It was faster than that, unnaturally so. My body was paralyzed, caught between fight or flight, unable to make a decision. I watched as it darted behind the doorway, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand still gripping the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The air was so thick, suffocating, and I could feel something pulling at me from inside the house, like I wasn't meant to leave. I don't know what I was expecting to happen next, but it wasn't what came. A sound, faint at first, echoed from the back of the house, almost like whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. But my body refused to move. It was like my legs were stuck in place, and I was rooted to the ground. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally managed to break free of that invisible force, I made a mad dash for the door. I slammed my shoulder into it, and this time it opened with a loud creak, the cold air rushing in to meet me. I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for breath, my heart racing like a drum in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. Ran without thinking, stumbling through the snow and ice, my legs burning as I pushed myself to go faster. The village was still eerily silent, not a single sound to break the overwhelming stillness. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away from that place, from whatever was lurking in that house. My breath came in ragged gasps, each step crunching in the snow, but the cold didn't seem to bother me anymore. I was sweating, the heat in my body betraying the freezing temperatures around me. And then I saw it again. The light. The same strange light from earlier, flickering in the distance. It was too far away to make sense of, but I could feel its pull, like it was guiding me, or maybe trying to get me back. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. I don't even remember deciding to move toward it. I just did. As I walked, the world around me seemed to distort again. The snow blurred, the trees bent in unnatural angles, and I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. I couldn't focus. My head was spinning. The light seemed to pulse, like it was alive, drawing me closer. I tried to stop, tried to turn back, but it felt like something was forcing me forward. My thoughts became a blur, and it wasn't until I felt my body tremble uncontrollably that I realized the cold had returned. The sharp bite of winter in the air was unbearable, and that was when I saw it, above me. It was there, hanging in the sky, just above the trees, about the size of a large truck, but completely silent. The light I had been following. But this wasn't like before. It wasn't just a flicker or a glow anymore. It was a solid, blinding orb of light, almost like it was pulling the very stars toward it. It didn't move, not at first. It just hung there, as if waiting for me. I stood frozen, staring at it, unable to look away. I knew in the pit of my stomach that it wasn't natural. My heart pounded harder in my chest as I realized how alone I truly was. No sound, no movement, just the light, and me, standing in the middle of nowhere, unable to do anything but watch. It was like time had stopped. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if my legs were glued to the ground. I felt my body start to shake, violently at first. Then it spread through me like an electrical current. I could taste the static in the air. A cold, almost metallic taste filled my mouth. And then, without warning, the light began to pulse, slowly at first, then faster, until it felt like the whole world was vibrating in time with it. A deep hum filled the air, so low it felt like it was coming from the very ground beneath me. I felt a presence, something behind me, watching me. I didn't need to turn around to know. It was there, in the periphery of my vision, but I was too terrified to look. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the light. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time was no longer something I could rely on. It was slipping through my fingers, just like everything else. And then, the humming stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was unbearable, suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. It was then that I felt it. A shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature so sharp it made my skin crawl. I shivered violently, feeling my breath catch in my throat. I could see my breath now, thick and white in front of me. I didn't know what was happening, but I had a terrible feeling that whatever it wasn't good. The air felt wrong, heavy. My vision blurred, my head spinning, and I stumbled, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me. The world around me twisted, and in the middle of it, the light flickered one last time, before it shot upward, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It didn't make a sound as it disappeared into the night sky, leaving me standing there in the freezing cold, alone. I don't know how long I stood there, dazed, staring up into the sky. Everything felt empty. It wasn't until I finally looked down that I realized the landscape around me had changed. I wasn't where I had been before. The trees were gone, replaced by smooth white snow as far as the eye could see. The road, the village, everything was gone. I could see nothing but this vast, empty wilderness. I don't know how I got there, but I knew I had to leave. I turned, trying to head back to where I thought the village might be, but it was as though the world had shifted around me. Nothing made sense. My feet crunched through the snow, and the cold stabbed into my bones. I felt disoriented, like I had just woken up from a dream, but the dream was still there, haunting me. I didn't know where to go, where to turn, and that's when I realized something else. The truck. The truck was gone. No trace of it anywhere. I searched the area frantically, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything that had happened. It was as though everything I'd experienced had been erased, wiped away, like it had never been real to begin with. But it was real. I knew it. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I didn't know how I knew, but I couldn't shake it. My mind refused to accept that I had just imagined it all. And as I stood there, in the middle of nowhere, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked up one last time, hoping for a glimpse of the light, or maybe just some sign that I hadn't completely lost my mind. But there was nothing. The sky was as dark as it had ever been, the stars faint pinpricks in the vast black. I started walking again, aimlessly, desperately trying to find anything that made sense. But the further I went, the more I felt like I was sinking into something that wasn't real. My legs grew tired, my breath came in shallow gasps, and everything around me seemed to close in. The weight of the cold pressed down on me, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. That awful, suffocating silence. It followed me. It never left. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, days. Maybe it was only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The next thing I remember, I was standing at the side of the road again. The same road. The truck was there, as if it had never moved. I got in, turned the engine on, and just drove. I don't know how, but I did. The road stretched on endlessly, but this time, I didn't see the lights. I didn't see the village. It was like I was driving through a dream, or through a memory that didn't belong to me. I never stopped. I just kept going, never looking back. And the worst part, I still don't know what happened. I still don't know how I got from one place to the other. I can't explain it. I haven't told anyone, not a soul. They wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw. And I know that whatever happened out there in the snow, whatever pulled me into that village, whatever I encountered in the sky, it was real. And it's still out there. Second story, the case of Rastro River Mountain, Brazil, 1984. It was just another night. I was driving through Serra do Rio do Rastro, one of the most treacherous and winding mountain roads in southern Brazil. It was past midnight, and the usual mix of exhaustion and the eerie stillness of the road set in. The air was cold, biting even, but that wasn't unusual. The road was almost empty, just me, the truck, and the dark night stretching out for miles. I'd driven this stretch more times than I could count, but tonight something felt different. The mist was thicker than usual, wrapping itself around the trees like some kind of shadowy hand, and the road ahead seemed to curve endlessly into nothingness. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was the headlights of another vehicle in the distance, but something about the way the lights hovered unnaturally between the trees didn't sit right. They weren't moving, just suspended in the air. I slowed down, squinting to get a better look, but it only made it worse. The lights stayed perfectly still, like they were waiting for me. I felt a chill creep over me, even though I was in the cab of the truck. Something was off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that I'd never seen anything like this before. I didn't think about it too much at first. I figured it was probably just some weird reflection or lights from a nearby house. But something deep inside told me I was wrong. The strange glow was unlike anything I had ever encountered before. It wasn't like any car's headlights or even any kind of flashlight you'd use. It wasn't a solid beam of light. It just seemed to hover, almost like it was floating in the air, casting no real shadows and moving in no direction. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but I didn't want to approach either. But then, as if something had taken over me, I got out of the truck. My boots crunched on the frozen ground, and I was instantly hit with that sharp coldness that cuts right through you. I had this weird feeling like I was being drawn in, almost like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. The lights, still floating there between the trees, were so captivating, I didn't even notice the strange quiet that surrounded me. It was like the wind had stopped blowing. The usual hum of the engine had disappeared, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. The closer I got to the lights, the more everything around me seemed to fade away. My movements felt sluggish, slow, like my body wasn't reacting the way it should. I was still walking, but it felt like I was moving through thick syrup, like my feet didn't want to leave the ground. As soon as I stepped out into the clearing, it happened. A sudden, intense burst of light hit me square in the chest, and I froze. It was like being hit by a wave of heat that wasn't heat, a pressure that pushed in from all sides. My body locked up, and my mind went blank. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came out. It was like I was stuck in some kind of invisible trap. I wanted to look around to see what was happening, but I couldn't turn my head. The light surrounding me wasn't harsh, like a flashlight or a car's high beams. It was different. It seemed softer somehow, but still, it was overwhelming. I couldn't make sense of anything. All I could feel was this pressure, this energy pushing me down, suffocating me, and I was completely powerless to stop it. My heart was pounding in my chest faster and faster, but there was no escape. The coldness from the night air seemed to slip away, replaced by an unexplainable warmth that wasn't comforting, but unsettling. It was like the whole world was watching me, pressing in, waiting for something. But for what? I didn't know. I don't know how long I was standing there, paralyzed. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it wasn't. Time stopped making sense. My vision began to blur, and I swear I felt like I was drifting in and out of consciousness. The light that enveloped me wasn't like anything I had ever seen. It was bright, yes, but not blinding. And in some strange way it seemed to flicker, almost like it was alive, pulsing with some kind of rhythm I couldn't understand. My body ached, and I could feel a strange tingling sensation crawling up my limbs, as if something was probing me, invading my very skin. I wanted to scream again, to break free, but my mouth felt sealed shut. Everything was out of my control. I couldn't even feel my legs anymore, like they weren't there at all. My body was entirely disconnected from my mind. I didn't know if I was still in the world I knew, or if I had slipped into something else entirely. All I could do was stand there, frozen, and wait for whatever was happening to me to unfold. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the light flickered one last time and went out. I don't remember exactly how I ended up back in the truck, but when I opened my eyes, I was sitting there in the driver's seat, staring out into the darkness. Everything around me looked the same. The truck was still parked on the side of the road, the mist still clung to the trees, and the eerie silence remained, like nothing had changed. But I knew something had. I felt wrong. I looked at the dashboard clock. Hours had passed. I couldn't explain how, but I had lost time. The light that had been there, the force that had paralyzed me, all of it was gone. But the unsettling feeling remained, hanging in the air, thick like smoke. My head was pounding, a deep, pulsing pain that wouldn't go away. It was as if something had burrowed deep inside my skull and was still lingering there. I felt sick, disoriented, like I wasn't fully awake. I could feel the cold sweat on my back, my palms clammy against the steering wheel. I tried to shake it off, but every movement felt foreign, as if my body wasn't quite responding the way it should. My thoughts were scrambled, and I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? But I couldn't deny the fear I still felt, deep in my bones. Something wasn't right. When I finally managed to collect myself enough to get out of the truck, I noticed the ground around me. The snow, which had been thick when I parked, was now completely melted, but only in a perfect circle around the truck. The edges of the circle were sharp, like someone had drawn it with a ruler. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for how the snow could melt so perfectly in such a small area. The ground wasn't warm. It hadn't been for hours. I took a step closer, my feet crunching on the exposed earth. My mind raced. Could it have been a car's exhaust, maybe some heat from the engine? But that wouldn't explain the way the snow melted so precisely. And no car could have been there, not in the spot where I had parked. I looked around. The road was empty, silent. I felt that weird, uncomfortable sensation again, the one where it felt like I wasn't alone, even though there was no one there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching me the entire time. I bent down, running my hand over the bare ground, but the coldness of it made me recoil. It felt like something had been here, something that didn't belong. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind racing. The logical part of me tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but the more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. I hadn't seen any other vehicles. No one had passed. By no one had stopped. The snow had just melted in a perfect circle with no explanation. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself I was just tired or imagining things. But deep down, I knew something had happened. Something had changed. I felt this gnawing fear in my gut, an instinct that told me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. But my legs felt weak, like I had been drained of all strength. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to think about what had happened during those hours I couldn't remember. But the fear, the unease, it wouldn't let go. It was as if the night itself had shifted, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got back into the truck, heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut, locking it with a nervous tremor in my hands. My fingers hovered over the ignition, but I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, staring out into the dark, hoping for something familiar to break the silence, something that would convince me I hadn't lost my mind. But nothing came. The world outside the truck remained still, eerily quiet. Even the wind, which had been a constant companion in the mountains, had stopped. I started the engine and began to drive, but it felt like I was moving in slow motion. My head was spinning, and the pain in my skull was still there, pulsing with every turn of the wheel. The lights of the truck bounced off the road ahead, illuminating the fog that clung to the trees like a veil. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything that might explain what had just happened. But it was just me, alone. The road seemed endless, and the further I drove, the more the sense of unease settled in. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the fog, but there was nothing. Just the same empty road stretching out behind me. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself it was over, that whatever it was gone. But the fear wouldn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, crawling under my flesh, making my heart race. I drove for what felt like hours, though I'm sure it was less than an hour. The landscape outside remained unchanged, just dark, looming trees and the endless winding road. But the fear inside me grew. My stomach churned, and I felt the urge to pull over, to stop and gather myself. But I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be able to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wanted to get home, get somewhere safe, but every mile felt like a step closer to the unknown. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, and every small sound made me jump. A gust of wind, a branch scraping against the truck, the hum of the engine. It all seemed amplified in the silence. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something ahead. A light. It was faint at first, just a flicker in the distance, but it grew brighter as I got closer. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't be sure, but something about it felt wrong. My mind raced. Was it another vehicle? Or was it something else? Whatever it was, it wasn't like any light I had ever seen before. I slowed down instinctively, my eyes fixed on it. But as I got closer, the light disappeared. Just vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the cold air and my racing thoughts. I couldn't explain it. One moment the light was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. I should have been relieved, It didn't make sense to chase after something that might have just been a figment of my imagination, but the tension in my body didn't let go. I felt like I needed to know what it was. I should have turned around. I should have driven faster. But I couldn't, not with that feeling gnawing at me. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the road ahead, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, as I passed the spot where the light had been, my heart skipped again. There, in the dirt, was a perfect circle, just like the one by the truck, only this time it wasn't snow. The dirt around the circle was scorched, almost like it had been burned. I couldn't stop myself from pulling over again, even though every instinct screamed at me to keep going. I got out of the truck, stepping into the night air once more. The silence was oppressive. The smell of burnt earth filled my nostrils, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was no sign of fire, no smoke, no flames, just this perfect charred circle in the middle of the road. It made no sense. The only explanation I could come up with was that someone had been here, and that something had done this. And now, it felt like whatever had happened before was starting again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that circle in the dirt. I wanted to run. I wanted to drive away and never come back to this place. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I could barely move. It was like the moment I stepped outside the truck, I was drawn into this weird, suffocating atmosphere, and all I could do was observe. Watch. I couldn't look away. The circle in the dirt burned into my mind, and then, just as suddenly as the light had vanished earlier, I heard a noise. A low, humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the sound of wind or any animal or anything I could recognize. It was just there. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the road, and the silence. I felt my pulse race like I was being hunted, like something was closing in. The humming grew louder, more intense. I slammed the truck door behind me and jumped back into the cab, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I couldn't breathe. I had to leave. I couldn't be here anymore. But something kept pulling me back. Something kept telling me that I wasn't supposed to leave. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it deep in my gut. It was like I wasn't just part of this world anymore, like I had been pulled into something else. I finally managed to start the truck, but my hands were trembling so hard that I almost couldn't grip the wheel. I slammed my foot on the gas and the engine roared to life, breaking the eerie silence. I tore down the road, my heart still pounding in my chest. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The air in the cab was thick, and I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see lights or figures, something chasing me. But there was nothing. Just the fog, stretching endlessly behind me. But that hum, that low vibrating sound, was still there. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but as I drove it grew louder. I could feel it in my bones. It was like the hum was in the air, surrounding me, crawling under my skin. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears alone. It was something I could feel. The walls of the truck seemed to pulse with it. My head began to ache again, sharper now, like something was gnawing at the inside of my skull. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. All I could do was keep driving, keep moving forward, praying that whatever was chasing me would stop, that it would just leave me alone. But I knew deep down that it wasn't going to stop, that it was never going to stop. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror again, and I swear I saw something. Just for a moment. Something that wasn't there before. A shadow. A dark, shapeless form that seemed to shift and pulse, stretching unnaturally across the empty road behind me. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew it hadn't been a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. I felt the weight of it, the presence, as if whatever it was had been right there, only inches away from the back of the truck. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine screaming as I pushed the truck to go faster. But the road seemed endless, and that damn hum, it never stopped. The sound was suffocating, filling the truck, making my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. My eyes darted to the clock on the dashboard. The time was wrong again. The numbers didn't add up. How had I driven this far in such a short span? I couldn't explain it. Every second felt stretched, like I was moving through thick tar, and yet the scenery outside kept blurring together. The trees, the road, the fog, it all melted into one black void, swallowing everything whole. I started to feel dizzy, like my body was losing its connection to the real world. My vision blurred again, and the pain in my head intensified, almost unbearable. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but nothing was making sense anymore. It was like I was in a dream, but it wasn't the kind of dream you wake up from. It felt real. Too real. Like my body was still physically here, but my mind had been pulled somewhere else, somewhere beyond. I gripped the steering wheel with everything I had, trying to force myself back into my own skin. I needed to wake up, to break free from whatever had a hold on me. But the deeper I drove into the night, the more the world around me seemed to warp. The truck started to feel lighter, like I wasn't even touching the ground anymore. My hands went numb on the wheel. I could no longer hear the hum. It was replaced by something else now, a sharp, almost electrical buzz that made my teeth ache. A voice in my head screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop the truck. I couldn't stop myself. And then, in a blink, I saw it. The figure in the rearview mirror again. This time, it was clearer. Not just a shadow, but something. Someone. Its eyes were black, endless, hollow, and they stared directly at me. I slammed my foot on the brake. The truck lurched, its tires screeching against the road as I tried to control it, but it felt like the vehicle wasn't responding to me at all. The figure in the mirror was growing closer, getting bigger. I swerved, panicking, but the road seemed to stretch and bend in ways that didn't make sense. The trees began to lean toward the truck, their branches twisting, bending as though they were alive, reaching for me. The sky overhead was a sickly shade of green now, and the lights on the dashboard flickered, dimming and brightening in a chaotic rhythm. I heard something then, something like a whisper. It wasn't words, just a sound, but it was all around me, vibrating in my chest. I could feel it, in my bones, in my blood. And that's when I knew. I wasn't alone. Whatever had been following me wasn't just in the rearview mirror. It was here, in the truck with me. I felt its presence press down on me, suffocating, as if it had been inside me the whole time, waiting. My vision went dark. The next thing I remember, I was back at the base of the mountains. It was morning, the sun was rising, and the road looked the same. But I felt different, like I had been gone, like I had returned from somewhere far away. I looked at the dashboard clock again, and this time, the time was right. Everything was normal, but I knew it wasn't. Something had changed. I couldn't remember the drive, the road, the figure. Nothing. It was all a blur. But I knew that whatever happened out there, I was not the same person. I couldn't explain what happened, and I never will. But I know that the things I saw, felt, they were real, and they've been with me ever since. I don't know what they were or why they chose me, but every night I feel them, watching, waiting. I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Whatever it is, it's still out there, and it's waiting for me to return. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, The Encounter of Luigi Mileto, Italy, 1981. It was just another night on the road, the kind I'd been driving for years, hauling goods across Campania, Italy. I was used to the quiet, the emptiness of those back roads. There's a weird peace about driving in the middle of nowhere. It's almost like the world falls away, and all that exists is the hum of the engine and the faint glow of the headlights cutting through the dark. But then, something happened that made my skin crawl. A light. At first I thought it was just another truck coming the other way, maybe with high beams on, but that's not what it was. This light wasn't moving like any vehicle I'd ever seen. It was hovering, floating in the air, bright, almost blinding. I slowed down, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. The closer I got, the stranger it became. It wasn't like any light I'd ever encountered. It was like the sun itself had dropped down to earth. The truck, the engine, everything I knew started failing. The lights on the dashboard flickered, then went out. The steering wheel stiffened. The truck wouldn't move. I pressed on the gas, but the engine refused to respond. That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. The road was quiet. Eerily quiet. I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. I was trapped. I was stuck in a moment that didn't make sense. I sat there in the silence, just staring at the light. It felt like it was alive, like it was watching me, pulling me in. It wasn't just the light that terrified me. It was the stillness, the way everything felt frozen in time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was impossible. I tried to open the door, thinking I'd maybe get out and figure it out, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen, my limbs heavy, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't even blink. The light continued to shine, and then, suddenly, it began to descend. Slowly, so slowly, it lowered itself toward me. I had no idea what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might burst. And then, without warning, the truck completely shut down. Everything went black for a second, and then it felt like I was being lifted, like gravity had just let go of me. I was no longer in the truck, no longer on that road. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like I was floating, being pulled through something. I had no control. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was feel the strange pull on my body as I was lifted out of the truck and into the air. The next thing I knew, I was inside something. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't on that road anymore. I wasn't in the truck. I was in a place that felt cold, metallic, and sterile. The air smelled like something I couldn't place. sharp, almost medicinal. It was bright, but not the same blinding light from before. It was more like a dull, artificial glow, casting long shadows that didn't seem to match up with anything. I couldn't see any windows, no doors, just walls that seemed to stretch forever, all smooth and shiny, like they were made of some kind of metal I didn't recognize. My head was spinning and I couldn't focus. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I couldn't even move, not properly. There was a pressure on my chest, like someone was sitting on top of me, keeping me still. I could feel something moving in the air around me, but I couldn't make out what it was. Then, out of nowhere, I saw them. These figures, tall, thin, and pale, with skin that seemed almost black, like shadows come to life. Their eyes were huge, impossibly large, black as coal with no whites, just black. I couldn't look away. It was like they were staring directly into my soul. I tried to speak, tried to ask them what was going on, but no words came out. Instead, images started flooding my mind. Not like regular thoughts, but like flashes of scenes, things I didn't understand. Places, faces, and feelings. I wasn't hearing words, but I understood what they were telling me. It was like they were communicating through images, through emotions. The whole experience was overwhelming, like they were pushing thoughts into my head, drowning me in them. But the worst part was the feeling, the horrible, suffocating feeling of being nothing. Like I didn't exist, like I was just an object to them. I tried to scream, tried to fight back, but I was frozen again, stuck in that awful, silent place, with those creatures who were showing me things I couldn't comprehend. The images kept coming, one after another, like a slideshow I couldn't stop. Some of them felt familiar, others were completely alien to me. There were flashes of places I didn't recognize, landscapes stretching out under a sky I couldn't name. I saw faces, strange faces, blurred and distorted, people I didn't know. And then came the sensations. I felt their hands, or whatever they had in place of hands, touching me, though I couldn't see them clearly. It wasn't like they were physically touching my skin, but more like their presence was invading me. They were probing, exploring, without any care for my discomfort. I don't know how long this went on, but it felt like hours, or maybe days. Time was meaningless. I could feel my mind unraveling under the weight of it all. And the worst part, I felt like they were learning about me, everything about me. My memories, my fears, my secrets. They were downloading them into themselves, stealing them from my brain. I wanted to fight it, but there was nothing I could do. My body wasn't mine anymore. My thoughts weren't mine. Everything I had, everything I was, felt like it was slipping away into their hands. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. Hell, I couldn't even think clearly anymore. I just wanted to wake up, to be back on the road, to make sense of anything. But the more I tried to hold on to myself, the more it slipped through my fingers. There was no escape from this place. It was then that something inside me snapped. A primal instinct kicked in, and for the first time, I managed to break free of whatever it was that had been holding me. I don't know how, but I somehow started to move. My hands, my feet, my body. I could feel them again. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I opened my eyes, or I think I did, and I saw the creatures again. They were closer now, their black eyes boring into me. I didn't understand their language, but in that moment I realized something. They were afraid of me. I don't know how I knew that. but I did. There was something about my presence, my resistance, that was unsettling to them. It was like I had become something they didn't expect. It was the only power I had left, this feeling of defiance. They seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then, just like that, the pressure I'd felt on my chest lifted. The strange sensation of being pulled from one place to another vanished. I don't know how, but suddenly, I was back. Back in my truck, sitting on that road, the engine sputtering back to life like nothing had happened. I couldn't process it. I didn't understand it. I looked around and everything seemed the same, but it wasn't. I had no idea where I was or how much time had passed. I checked my watch. It had been hours. Hours that I couldn't remember. I had no memory of anything after that moment when I was lifted into the air. It was like they had erased it from my mind. I didn't know what to think. Was I dreaming? Had it all been some sort of nightmare? I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced wasn't just in my head. The terror, the strange images, the creatures, I could still feel them inside me, like their presence was still lingering in the air, wrapping itself around my thoughts. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. I tried to start the truck again, but the engine hesitated. The light was gone. The road was empty, but everything felt wrong. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to drive away from that place, but I couldn't. Something was holding me there, like I wasn't meant to leave. I glanced at the dashboard. The clock read 3:47 a.m. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The truck wasn't where I remembered it being. The landscape around me had changed. The road I was on was different. There were no familiar landmarks, no signs that I recognized. It was as if I had been transported to a completely different part of the countryside. I felt dizzy. My mind was racing. Had I really been taken somewhere? Had I been abducted? No, that couldn't be possible. But everything in my body told me it was. I'd seen those creatures. I'd felt their presence. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was real. That's when the fear set in. What if they came back? What if they were still watching me? I don't know how long I sat there in that truck, staring at the road ahead, but it felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My mind was racing through everything that had happened, trying to piece it together, but it was like trying to grab smoke with my bare hands. I knew what I had seen. Those dark figures with their oversized eyes, their cold, alien stare. But I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. I wasn't sure I even wanted to understand. My body was telling me to leave, to get as far away as possible from whatever had just happened, but my mind kept dragging me back, forcing me to replay every detail over and over. I don't know how many times I checked the clock, hoping the time would make sense, hoping that the hours would somehow line up, but it never did. Every time I looked, more time had passed, but it felt like I had lost a chunk of it, like it had just vanished from my life. The road was empty, no signs of other vehicles, no other lights, just me, my truck, and the faint echo of what had happened. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what I had been through. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually, I started driving again. I don't even know why. Maybe it was the need to do something normal, to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The truck sputtered back to life, and I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. Every bump in the road, every curve made me jump. Every time the headlights illuminated the trees along the side of the road, I half expected to see something watching me from the shadows. The fear was like a weight pressing down on my chest, but there was no escaping it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that knew exactly where I was, something that was waiting for the right moment to show itself again. But nothing happened. The road stretched on, silent and empty. After a while, the fear started to fade, replaced by exhaustion. Maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off, or maybe I was just too tired to keep being scared. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, what had happened to me. Why had they chosen me? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I had been touched by something otherworldly, something beyond my comprehension, and it terrified me. The feeling that I was not alone in this world, that there were things out there watching, waiting. I kept driving for what felt like hours, lost in my thoughts, until I saw the first sign of civilization. A small town in the distance. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread. What if I told someone? Would they believe me? Would they laugh in my face? Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe it was all in my head. But I knew it wasn't. I had seen those creatures. I had felt them. And whatever happened to me that night, it wasn't just a dream. I didn't know if anyone else had experienced anything like it, but I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't the first. There had to be more. People like me who had seen things they couldn't explain, who had felt the same cold terror that had gnawed at me ever since. I pulled into the town, parking my truck outside a small diner. The lights inside were dim, and the place was mostly empty, save for a few truckers and locals. I got out, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. I walked in, trying to act like everything was normal, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a pair of eyes on me. It wasn't a regular look. It was the kind of gaze that felt too knowing, like they could see through me. I looked over at an older man sitting at the counter, a trucker by the looks of him. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, those eyes, they weren't normal. It was like he knew exactly what I had been through. I looked away quickly, but the feeling of being watched never left. I sat down at the counter, ordered some coffee, and tried to ignore the growing sense that I wasn't safe yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even as I sat there, nursing my coffee, I felt those eyes on me, the trucker at the counter, the older woman behind the register, the man in the corner booth who hadn't stopped glancing over at me. It wasn't normal. Something about the way they looked at me felt knowing, like they were all waiting for me to say something, or maybe they were just waiting for me to crack. I tried to focus on my coffee, but my hand was shaking so badly that I spilled some on the counter. The woman behind the counter gave me a sympathetic look, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, like she knew something I didn't. I didn't want to speak to her. I didn't want to speak to anyone. The fear that had been haunting me on the road now followed me into this small town diner. I couldn't escape it. It was like everything was connected, like I had been drawn here, like they had wanted me to be here. "You okay, kid?" the trucker asked, his voice rough like gravel. I glanced up at him, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark, something unsettling. I didn't answer. I just nodded, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. I wasn't okay. I wasn't even close to okay. And for the first time I realized none of this felt like it was going to stop. They had touched me, and now they were watching me. watching me from a distance, waiting for something. And I didn't know what that something was, but I knew it was bad. I paid for my coffee and left the diner as quickly as I could. My hands were still trembling as I slid into the truck, gripping the steering wheel as if it was my lifeline. Tried to focus on the road, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt the weight of those eyes on me again. The town was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound, no hum of life. It felt abandoned, like it had been frozen in time. And then there was the constant dread, gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone or something was out there, tracking my every move. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the road. As I drove, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to what I had seen, the creatures, their black eyes, the telepathic images that invaded my thoughts. I could still feel their presence like it was etched into my soul. It was all too much. My head started to pound and the road seemed to stretch out endlessly before me. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, keep driving. Maybe if I drove far enough, the fear would go away. Maybe it would all fade like a bad dream. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't. Because whatever had happened to me on that road, whatever had taken me, was not something that could be erased. It was inside me now. It had marked me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running from it. I don't remember exactly when I stopped driving, but at some point I found myself on the side of another road, the truck parked on a quiet dirt path. I had pulled off, I guess, without realizing it. I don't know why I stopped. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to be here in the middle of nowhere, with that creeping sense of something still watching. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. It was late, early morning maybe. My mind was still clouded, foggy from the experience. I felt completely disoriented, like I didn't know where I was anymore. I couldn't even remember how I had gotten there. I tried to take a deep breath, to calm myself, but then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the crickets that made me feel uneasy. It was the silence. A silence so thick it was almost suffocating. I looked around. Nothing. Just the road, the trees, the distant hills. But I felt it. That cold, unshakable feeling, like they were still there, watching me, waiting for me. It wasn't over. I had been given no answers, no closure. I hadn't even begun to understand what had happened, but one thing was clear. This experience, whatever it was, had marked me. And somehow, I knew that I wasn't alone anymore. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in the truck, but it felt like hours. Every second, the sense of dread grew heavier. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. It wasn't like before. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. There was something more to it. Something I couldn't see but felt all around me, like a presence in the air. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. The time was wrong. I had no memory of how I had gotten here. It was like those hours I had lost were still slipping away, as if they were never mine to begin with. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, no service, nothing. I grabbed the keys and threw the truck into gear, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that something was coming. The engine started up with a growl, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was hollow, like the truck itself was an extension of something that shouldn't be. I pulled back onto the road, my grip tightening around the wheel. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything. I don't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me. It was like I had been branded by them, marked in some way that wasn't visible, but was impossible to ignore. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on the road ahead, but every time I looked into the rear-view mirror, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was right behind me. The night seemed to stretch on forever. I kept driving faster and faster, trying to outrun the terror that clung to me like a second skin. I didn't know where I was going or why, but it didn't matter. I had to keep moving. The roads were desolate, empty. I didn't pass a single car for hours. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement, the occasional rattle of the truck as it powered down the road. I don't know why, but I kept thinking about the creatures. Those dark figures, their piercing eyes. I kept picturing their faces, how they seemed to look right through me like I was nothing. I couldn't get their faces out of my head. The more I thought about them, the more I wondered. What had they wanted from me? Why had they chosen me? The questions wouldn't stop. And then, just as I was starting to lose my grip on reality, the truck began to sputter. My stomach sank. The engine stalled. My heart raced. The lights on the dashboard flickered, and for a moment, the truck rolled to a stop on its own, as if someone had forced it to. It wasn't like any engine failure I had ever experienced. It felt deliberate. I sat there, frozen, staring at the dashboard, trying to figure out what had just happened. My hands were clammy, and my whole body felt like it was vibrating with nervous energy. The truck wasn't moving, and for a moment, neither was I. I looked out the window. Darkness. Nothing. I couldn't even hear the usual sounds of the night. No crickets, no wind, just the heavy, suffocating silence. And then I heard it. A sound, distant at first, like a low hum, almost imperceptible but growing louder. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of it. The noise seemed to be coming from above me. I didn't want to look up, but I had to. Something deep inside me knew I had no choice. I forced my neck to crane, my heart pounding in my ears. There, just above the truck, hovering in the sky, was a light. A small dot at first, but then it expanded. It was bright, too bright, almost blinding. I could feel the heat radiating from it, even though it was still far above me. It didn't make sense. I shouldn't have been able to feel it from that distance. My mind went into overdrive, trying to process what I was seeing. I knew what it was. I knew, even though I didn't want to admit it. It was them, the beings. They were back. The light grew brighter, its intensity cutting through the night like a blade. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me. I didn't even think to fight it. My body was frozen, paralyzed, unable to move. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was a kind of resignation, as if I had already accepted that whatever was happening was beyond my control. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the truck, rattling my bones. It felt like the entire world had shifted, like the laws of nature no longer applied. Time itself seemed to bend. I glanced down at my watch. Half an hour had passed, or maybe more. I had no idea. My pulse was pounding in my ears, louder than the hum. I wanted to scream, to jump out of the truck and run, but I couldn't move. The light seemed to reach for me, pulling me toward it. I could feel myself lifting, slowly, just inches off the seat. My stomach churned as the world around me began to distort, warping like ripples in water. That's when it happened. The overwhelming sensation of floating. My feet no longer touched the ground. I looked down in horror, realizing I was rising out of the truck, but there was no movement from my body. I wasn't in control anymore. I could see the truck beneath me, now just a small speck on the ground below. The cold fear that gripped me was replaced by something worse, something indescribable, something that made me wish I could just disappear entirely. I don't know how long I floated in the air, disoriented, terrified, but I was slowly pulled toward the light. The next thing I remember, I was inside it. Inside the light. But it wasn't a light anymore. It was a space, or a room, though it didn't feel like one. It was as if I was in a place that wasn't really a place at all. Everything around me was dim, yet the light was still there, pressing against my eyes, blinding me. I could barely make out shapes, but they were there, figures, shadows, moving around me. I didn't see their faces, but I could feel them, their presence. It wasn't physical, not in the way we understand physicality. It was telepathic. And that's when it hit me. They were communicating with me, not through words, but through images, sensations. I felt the fear that I had been carrying inside me my whole life, and it was theirs too. I felt their confusion, their curiosity, their cold detachment. I saw flashes of places, faces, all moving in rapid succession as though they were trying to show me something, or maybe trying to learn something about me. But there was no connection, no understanding, just a cold, eerie distance. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But nothing came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was feel. And then, just as suddenly as it all started, it stopped. The images, the sensations, the paralyzing fear, it all disappeared in an instant. One moment I was surrounded by their presence, and the next, I was back in the truck. But it wasn't the same truck. It wasn't the same place. I was no longer on that quiet dirt road. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The truck was parked on the side of a highway now, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The night was gone, replaced by the harsh light of day. I looked down at my hands, my legs. They were shaking uncontrollably. My watch read a time that didn't make sense. Hours had passed, hours that I couldn't account for. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs unsteady. The world around me felt distorted, like I was still floating. But now, I was on the ground. I looked at the sky, expecting to see that light again, but there was nothing. Just the ordinary blue of the morning. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew. I knew that whatever had happened to me, it wasn't over. The experience, the abduction, wasn't just a moment in time. It was inside me now, a part of me, and there was no going back. I don't know what they did to me, but I know that they left something behind, something that would never let me go. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.